The development of the methodologies that I've contributed toward and I'm still interested in pretty much started all the way back in I would say the middle part of World War II, where there were people, mathematicians, crypto analysts, statisticians, and so on, working in Britain and also in the US on developing methods to detect enemy planes, whether it's sonar or radar, who were breaking codes and so on. And there became a niche in this area of science that related to if you will, the science of organization behavior and the way in which we could perhaps develop techniques to optimize resources and so on. Many of these people were mathematicians or mathematical economists, people like Dancing and others who developed linear programming methods. And much of that then filtered over to the general business schools, of course, later on. So the 50s then, the 1950s, were pretty much a heyday of moving a lot of the business schools from what you might call case-like teaching to various paradigms that did have structure to them, that tried to make decisions better, not only decision theory, which I talked about earlier, but other types of models that can be used to allocate resources, to optimize business practices. And the Ford Foundation was quite active in not only sponsoring this, but moving it along and giving grants to various schools. In fact, my thesis advisor, Morris Hamburg, had attended one of these accelerated programs at Harvard, and that's where he had gotten interested in statistical decision theory. So the 50s could be viewed as the sort of mathematization of various techniques and the move away from at least to a great extent, away from just description of institutions and things of that sort. As these models developed, there was one particular problem, at least in the marketing side of these problems, of trying to find ways in which we could check to see whether this model really worked and optimized, and whether the kinds of statistical functions that we had, in other words, the reaction of people to these models, was predicted well. And it was that point where we had these very grand models, like trying to optimize the allocation of dollars across many advertising vehicles. That's a pertinent problem today. The models work, but very often we didn't have enough information on persons' reactions. So the decade of the 60s was now moving into an area that we call psychometrics, where a lot of the methods that I had started to work on statistically were now coming to fruition on the part of people working in mathematical psychology and psychometrics. So here we're moving away from the mathematization side and trying to quantify people's perceptions and their preferences and their behavior. And this engendered a whole new set of techniques, things like cluster analysis, which we now use routinely in market segmentation, multidimensional scaling, which are representations of various competitive spaces that people perceive products in. And of course, lastly but not leastly, conjoint analysis, which has been around again since the late 50s, early 60s. And these three sets of techniques have sort of dovetailed inside each other and, of course, given way to still further developments along those lines. If the 1950s can be viewed as the heyday of the operations researcher building on the military experiences, the 1960s can probably be viewed much more in the area of data analysis and the use of techniques like cluster analysis. Cluster analysis is a rather interesting technique in the sense that it tries to look at a diverse market and collects data, for example, on people's attitudes and preferences in that market. and lets the data speak for developing segments as opposed to preordaining the market segments that you're after. So what it does, it takes people's, let's say, attitudes, and these are measured in terms of various ways, and it starts to group people who have, in terms of their whole set of behaviors or preferences, like kinds of responses. Now, they don't have to be perfectly the same, but they should be close to each other. And then the group, it ends up partitioning this overall heterogeneous market into a set, typically 6 to 10, perhaps, segments of that market who are different from each other, considerably different from each other, but within that particular segment are very much alike, relatively speaking. So that the marketing manager now does not have to sort of depend on his own often scant knowledge of what people are doing and what their attitudes and behaviors are, but he has the data themselves speak for it. And then it's up to him to examine the possibility of alternative strategies of reaching these different segments. So that often leads to a very wide variety of products. Just the simple idea that not everybody wants the same thing. And to do this also in a competitive context, where your competitors are doing very much the same thing that you're doing and trying, of course, to find their niches as well. So it can become quite a complicated exercise. So as I indicated, the 60s started the area of cluster analysis as it's applied to market segmentation. In the 70s, we moved into the area of multidimensional scaling. And that is a technique, a whole series of techniques that actually looks at pictures. They say a picture is worth 1,000 words. We collect data on people's perceptions of things in terms of what automobile brands they think are similar to each other. Or in one case, when we worked for M&M candies, we had something like 75 different packaged candies of different sorts and different makers spread out on a table. And people were simply asked to go through and to make up, to their heart's content, clusters or collections or subsets of these candy bars that they thought were like each other, that sort of went together, and all from their subjective viewpoints of this. So that we were able then, using some of these techniques in multidimensional scaling, to examine the space of these competitive items, where a Mounds bar might be. Is it near a peanut butter brittle or something of this sort? And while it sounds a little bit far-fetched, these kinds of pictures became standard fare among business people, and many projects were commissioned to find out where I was in the space. In fact, there's a term now they use about the space that I'm in. They're talking about the certain kinds of competitors. That all came from multidimensional scaling back in the 1970s, because literally they saw pictures of a market where various competitors would be in one part of the space or another part of the space. Or even some developed three-dimensional models that they used as mobiles that hung from the ceiling. I saw one that Post Cereals did of all their cereal brands to indicate where they were and which ones would tend to compete with each other because they were closer in that space and which ones would not compete with each other. So it was kind of fun to work on. And to this day, people are using multidimensional scaling to what they call map markets. Well, the value of these techniques I've just mentioned, cluster analysis and multidimensional scaling, and also conjoint analysis, which I'll talk about later, is that they're all trying to reach in and to examine people's drives, their motivations, how they make decisions, the kinds of likes and dislikes, their motivations, the extent to which certain occasions are important to them for using particular products. And all of these kinds of soft data, as opposed to how old they are or whether they had 10 years of schooling or 12 years of schooling, In both the industrial markets, that's the surprising thing, and consumer markets, these soft data collections on attitudes, perceptions, and preferences are really sweeping the field. So that mostly now we're trying to get at how people's actual decisions and selections are made as they relate to various attitudinal data that we can collect and perceptions data. So there's a whole field out there that is concerned with collection of soft data so that it will guide people and say, well, this particular product, if it's a camera, if it's a chair, should have the following characteristics for these kinds of people, or this magazine, or this musical instrument, or whatever the context might be. Three techniques that I've had a lot to do with in my career are cluster analysis, which I've mentioned briefly about, and would like to augment that, multidimensional scaling, and lastly but not leastly, conjoint analysis, which is where I've spent a good part of my time. Clustering, as I've indicated, is concerned with breaking up markets that are quite heterogeneous, suggesting the possibility that one needs different products for different markets, and finding segments of that market and the kinds of things that that market would be interested in. This has a tendency, of course, to proliferate products because depending on how many segments you want to set up, you might have a different version of the product for each. Multidimensional scaling is really a data analysis adjunct that provides management with a very quick overview of how their product is positioned in this space vis-a-vis other competitive products. It could also be augmented where you have not only the, let's say, automobiles, if that's the thing that we're dealing with in the space, but also characteristics of individuals that are liable to, or likely, let's say, to purchase that particular car as opposed to some other car. These we call joint spaces, since they have more than one set of entities in them. But by and large, it's a data descriptive technique to give management quick pictures of what's going on in their marketplace and to show them if the texture of that marketplace is changing, that their positioning is being threatened, or that other people are coming in certain niches of the market that they would have some interest in themselves. And all of that kind of gets involved in a pictorial type of fashion. The problem with multidimensional scaling, which led to conjoint analysis, the problem with multidimensional scaling is that it's a rather passive picture of what's going on. It tells you what the market is now, as of t sub 0, as of now, which is good, but very often we're interested in what will the market be if I introduce a new product, or what would it be if a competitor introduced a new product. And that's where we need the ability to set up characterizations of various possible products in a marketplace, some of which may have high appeal, some of which may not have high appeal, with the sole intent being to get people to react to these stimuli or descriptions of products, which could be pictorial, could be verbal, in such a way that we can tease out the preferences that they're giving to various attributes, what we call part worths. In other words, to take a case, let's say, involving a car. You might have a particular interest in, I'm saying in general, may have a particular interest in whether it has, let's say, a back seat or not, whether it's just a two-seater, whether it has a convertible roof or not. And even if it has to have a convertible roof, the extent to which these roofs are different. Maybe one is back at the old canvas type, and the other is the more metallic, mechanized type. So what conjoint analysts do is to construct for viewing by consumers a variety of possible renderings, if you will, of a given object, whether it be a car, whether it be a piano, whether it be a season ticket for a series of games or whatever. And that product, whatever it is, will have characteristics of what we call attributes. Each attribute in terms has what we call levels or different variations of that attribute. And what we do in the process of administering conjoint analyses is to give people various options that they could evaluate and just ask for their preferences. Now, of course, what happens in real life is that if you come up with a large number of attributes and levels, you have literally, possibly hundreds of thousands or even millions of possible combinations. Imagine building a hotel from the ground up and all of the different features that could have. So we need another statistical technique to come into play, which are called factorial designs, that enable us to squeeze out the maximum information with a relatively small number of actual representations. So rather than give people, of course, 100,000 different ways that you could scale a hotel, they may get something like 20 or 30 or something of that sort, which sounds probably rather striking, but it turns out that you can estimate basically what we call the main effects, or the more important kinds of characteristics, from this very reduced kind of design. The object being, when you're all done, to find out people who are similar in terms of how they trade off, because that might constitute a particular segment, and build that particular object, whatever that object could be, for individual segments of the market. So of the three techniques, clustering, multidimensional scaling, and conjoint analysis, it seems, I think most people would agree, the conjoint analysis has been really the last one to get started, but clearly the major one in terms of its impact. Virtually everybody that is in the consulting field offers some kind of conjoint service, and some people have built a fortune on it. If we're talking about conjoint analysis, which I was just speaking of, I suppose when you expose, let's say, graduate students to it as a public, the kinds of things that come about in terms of their early questions are, first of all, just one of just sheer disbelief. I mean, how could you give people 9 things to evaluate, or even 27 to evaluate, and hopefully be able to predict what their evaluations would be of various combinations never shown to them? Well, the interesting part of conjoint analysis is that we're never really concerned with the specific answers that they give for the limited set that they get. These we are concerned with as how we construct new alternatives from this basic set of designs that will augment, of course, the sample set that they actually react to. So if we talked about, let's say, only 3 attributes that each had 3 levels. So if we went back to the Bissell type of project, you have the 3 cans, and you have the 3 brands, and you have the 3 prices. That would be 3 cubed, or 81 possibilities. And we're able to do that quite easily, let's say, in only 18 cases out of that. But it's this particular 18 out of that 81. And when a person comes back and gives us responses, they say, well, gee, why aren't you analyzing my responses? And we say, well, we indeed are, but we're not really worried about the 18 that you gave us. What we're really worried about and interested in are the ones that you didn't give us, that we can make these predictions. So the reliability of this technique is, first of all, pretty good. And is, of course, the prediction part is really what makes it go. Because what happens is, when you're doing a study of this sort, even for something as simple as the Bissell study, and clearly so for something like the Marriott Courtyard Hotel, which had something like 50 different attributes of 170 different levels, trying to construct, of course, a brand new type of hotel. But basically what you are, as I say, after is trying to use these, what we call part worths, or the particular value given to each level of each attribute, combine them now in a whole variety of ways, such that you can make predictions about things that the person never ever saw. And furthermore, you can put these, what we call part worths, into what we call a consumer choice simulator, which is a computer technique where these measurements are put in, one set for each individual, and then perhaps background data also describing that individual. And then the manager can play games. He can say, well, I'll have a microcosm of the market. I have this diverse set of people there. I might want to try to do what I would do with my product, let's say, vis-a-vis some other competitive product out there. Or I might add a new product to my current product line. How can I maximize the total contribution to overhead and profit with that new product being possibly in competition with itself in terms of my product line as well? All of these kinds of things now can be done with these simulators and optimizers. So it gives the manager, some might call it a toy, but a way to examine a whole series of what-if statements. What would happen if I tweaked it here, or I didn't put this particular feature on, and so on. And they're working on a microcosm of the market in so doing. Before these techniques that I've talked about became available, there were still market surveys being done. That has gone on for many, many years. In fact, George Parlin, I think, in 1917, started a marketing research survey house with the old, I think it was Saturday Evening Post or one of the early publications. And they would go out and they would survey people, and they would try to collect data in terms of their preferences and so on. But it was fairly crude type of data at that, and there was very little manipulation of that data to try to extract really the signal in it. What they would do, because computers at that time were essentially non-existent, they would be hand tabulations. And managers at that juncture couldn't see that close a connection with these sort of passive ways of collecting data on past events, as opposed to trying to look toward how we can change things. So the techniques were there. I'm not talking about the later ones, but the survey type technique and some rudimentary statistics were available even back in 1917 or in the 20s or 30s or 40s or 50s, but by and large limited to surveys and to some extent giving people pre-trials of a particular project that was underway. Causal modeling has to do with, first of all, setting up a type of theory. It's a type of idea in which you have certain sorts of antecedents and certain sorts of consequences. And this is incidentally an area that's under a lot of controversy. A lot of people think it's just baloney. But the idea being there that you can use correlation as a sort of substitute for causation is at the heart of this. To even call it causal modeling when all you're dealing with association among variables has the hackles raised by many people, not only in marketing, but in psychology and other fields. So it's very controversial. And in marketing, it's had a fairly big influence. And you have a sufficiently large core group that can talk to each other and get articles published because they'll be the referees for each other as well. So in some sense, it's succeeded on those grounds that they've taken a niche. Economic modelers are to some extent in that same area, but I think they've had higher reception. They haven't been chastised in some of the ways that the causal modelers have. A covariance structure analysis is a sort of cousin to causal modeling. The people who do that tend to be much more concerned with the development of sort of what we would call latent type models. It doesn't seem to carry the baggage that the causal modelists do. They don't go nearly that far. And they tend not to be marketers. They're more from the psychometrics field. Well, economic modeling has, I think, gotten more attention than either causal modelers or, in some cases, some of the work going on in consumer behavior modeling. And that's because there is a whole vast set of techniques and procedures that economists use that have some transfer of value over into marketing kinds of problems. So there's a well-respected background literature to be drawn on and to be applying these kinds of things to the marketing area. The more controversial side would be the causal modeling side. Game theory is a very intriguing area which started way back in the 20s with von Neumann and Morgenstern. These were both geniuses that tried to look, these were mathematicians, and perhaps you've seen the movie Beautiful Mind. One of the primary person in that is John Nash, who developed a lot of interest in bargaining theory and game theory. These are folks that are interested in developing ways to either outwit an opponent, ways in which to create a series of events that will protect them from the worst that the opponents can do. So it involves a heavy dose of mathematics. We've used one concept called Nash equilibrium in conjoint analysis, where we can set up a model that essentially says, I'm going to do X. And if I do X, Y, if it's in Y's best judgment, will behave accordingly. Y will do Y. And then if there's a Z will try to optimize against both of us. Then it'll come around to me again, and I might have to change my plan in view of what the retaliatory actions can be. Now, the interesting thing about that, you think it'll go on forever. It turns out in many cases, it starts to stabilize and actually reach what's called a Nash equilibrium. It is in no one's interest to depart from the spot that they are on because they'll do worse, even though the payoffs may be quite different for each one because of what they start out with. So that's a good example in a real live context of something that started out as a mathematical theory. Multidimensional scaling is the application of various statistical techniques, the end product of which is to develop quite literally a picture of a market, typically in terms of brands of cars or toothpaste or cereals, such that two things that are close together in that map are viewed by people as being highly substitutable for each other, and things that are far apart not substitutable. That's called a simple space. And in, let's say, a joint space, you have not only the automobiles, let's say, but people. And the people are in there in a sense of indicating the closer a particular car product is to them, the more they'll prefer it. And the farther away from them as a particular point in that space, the less they'll prefer it. So by inference, certain people will be close to each other because they prefer similar things. So you get really two sets for one set of things going in. Cluster analysis is a partitional technique, and there are two basic varieties. One is that you have a group of people that you think can be broken into subgroups such that people within each subgroup are like each other but quite different from those outside that subgroup for all such subgroups. And it ends up doing a partition where a person appears in one and only one such group. The more elaborate one, of which I have an example here, but we don't have to worry about that, is called hierarchical clustering. And that's a more detailed way of partitioning the market. The usual way is called an agglomerative procedure. Everybody starts out all by himself. Suppose we're clustering people based on their behaviors, and we have data on that. we find the two closest people and we join them in a little tree diagram that starts from the high branches and moves down to the trunk. So those two people get connected with a line indicating they're the closest pair that you can make up of all the possible pairs of individuals. Now the next step is, do I want to add a third person to that pair, or do I want to find another pair that's the next closest pair? And it checks out which that should be. So either something gets connected to a previous cluster, it starts out on a new cluster. Finally, the clusters themselves get clustered, so that at the end, as you go from these high branches of a tree, let's say laid on its side, all the way out to the root of the tree or the trunk of the tree, where everything now becomes one big amorphous cluster, and hence not useful to anybody. Conjoint analysis, we've probably done this one to death, is basically a choice technique in which we're trying to have people interested in a particular product class respond to various sorts of characterizations of that product or service, whether it's a hotel, whether it's a phone system, whether it's an automobile, and so on, where the study designer is able to give them representations that allow these various attributes to vary in various kinds of combinations. The whole idea of which is to tease out at the end the contribution of what we call part worth or part value of each of these particular levels of each attribute, so such that you can recombine them in any way that you wish and make predictions as to how people would react to real automobiles or real toothpastes or whatever. And that of the three has been the one that's been the most, I shouldn't say popular so much as the biggest story, I think, of the three. It also was the last one to kind of come in. The technique of information acceleration was developed, to the best of my knowledge, by Glenn Urban and his colleagues at MIT. It's a very interesting technique and a very involving technique in the sense that it tries to mirror, as best one can, the actual experience that a person, let's say, may have in going through and selecting a particular automobile. In fact, it was originally used in the context of automobile selection. So it takes into consideration not only the attributes and levels and aspects of what we might associate with conjoint analysis, but it also looks at various sources of information, either obtained actively by the individual or passively by watching some kind of video describing various characteristics. Sometimes they'll bring in a person who's going to evince the notion of trust, because there's a lot of suspicion in many cases about the dealer. So it's a much more elaborated approach, and probably, of course, longer in doing, and probably more expensive, but would probably, from the face of it, give one a better picture than the sort of once-over-lightly approach that the poor man's conjoint analysis would do. My MIT brethren, for example, Glenn Urban and John Hauser, have been very active in this field for some number of years and have done very, very nice work in it. I like to think of what we're doing as a kind of a poor man's information acceleration. We don't get into a lot of the details in which you get word-of-mouth advertising and various sorts of things dropped off at your door or whatever. We try a speedy approach, much like the Easy Pass system. They'll get exposed to a video, and that video will be either high detailed or not, as the case might be. But basically, that's going to be it. So it's like, we're going to give you some instant information and then hope for the best that it's enough. So clearly, they're much more elaborate, and the methodical approach is probably going to do better, one would think so, because it's got more variables in it. But one could also argue that there are many instances where maybe you don't need that level of detail. So both of us sort of survive. Both approaches are being used. Ironically, the first companies to start in a big way to utilize conjoint analysis, and I'll focus there because I think it's also to some extent representative of the other techniques. We're not consumer goods, which you would automatically think of, but people working in industrial goods and services. Many of these goods, for example, printers, copying machines, and so on, are very complex in the sense of having very many features that could be present or absent or could be working in different ways. So there's value in being able to use a technique that will help us design that particular product. Moreover, that particular kind of product is going to be going to engineers and others who have an interest in the intricacies of a particular product and how it would benefit or not their particular business. So for the first few years, we're in either consumer durables, for example, trucks or automobiles or houses in some sense being designed, or in the area of industrial goods. Now, what has happened when you move over to consumer perishables, for example, foods and beverages, or toiletries? You have another kind of problem that you're faced with. First of all, it's very difficult to really describe what a particular food is like, other than to give a person actually a taste of that food. So if you're trying to build a perfect pizza, which we actually did a study on, I might add, you have all these manifold possibilities of combining the sauce and the type of crust and its thickness and whether it has pepperoni and so on. The actual study that we did for Celeste, makers of frozen pizza, involves something like 181,000 different possible combinations. And people actually received only 9, but they were different sets that overlay. So in this particular case, you're talking about actually having people taste, smell, get the mouth feel, if you will, of that particular item. So now you're starting to see conjoint analysis being used in the development of various kinds of flavors, various kinds of ice creams. That's a particular project that we worked on before. Kraft Foods, which is what a company that we're dealing with right now, is interested in applying this methodology to all of their food lines, starting with pizza. So the idea being here, how rich should the ingredients be? What would happen if we reduce the amount of cheese, let's say, relative to the sauce? That kind of thing. You go through a whole variety of experiments, but the proof is in the eating. What people do is, of course, taste that pizza along with certain controls and give you information about that, from which, again, you build the models that I've been talking about. I think one of the so-called defining moments, or as you kind of work through this field, comes to you not necessarily in an instant, but as a kind of a gradual accumulation over time of the beauty of some of these techniques. For example, when I teach students about multidimensional scaling, and I say, well, we're going to give people, let's say, information of the following. We're going to ask you to take each, let's say, of several cities, suppose there are, say, 10 of them, and try to indicate a rank ordering, if you will, of all the other cities, from each city in turn serving as the kind of anchor point or reference point. So they do this for each city in turn. And all you're getting here is rank order data. But wouldn't it be nice if you were able, in some sense, to convert that rank order data, not from just the ordinal or ranking parts of it, but into a map, such that the distances between these cities on a map-type basis, on a picture-type basis, are very well preserved. In other words, if you try to overlay an actual tracing of the whole USA, you would find that those cities, just from these rank order input data, would bear a very, very close relationship to their actual locations. That's mind-boggling. And it's mind-boggling because people think it's some violation of information principle, that you just don't have enough input. And then when you tell them, effectively, each of these rank orders is very, very crude information, but there are a lot of those bits of information. Because in some sense, if you look at 10 choose 2, that's 45 different pairs of cities. So even though all you know is the rank order of those 45 pairs, there are 45 of them, as opposed to just looking at showing their distances in two-dimensional space, there would be only 20 points. But those 20 points, actually, there'd be a few less with that. We could start with 20. But those 20 points are more strongly scaled information, but there are fewer of them. So it's like taking a lot of crummy data, a lot of dilute information data, and squeezing out of it information that is viewed in the more general sense as measured information. As you may know, a lot of people are hyping the general idea of segments of one. By that, we mean the opportunity to have so many variations of a given product that one could satisfy individuals with that particular variation. And in fact, to deliver that with, again, gains being made in specialized kinds of manufacturing at a reasonable price to pay. This, of course, begs the question of how do we get at what people's preferences are. And one aspect of conjoint analysis, which I think is embodied in the traffic pulse example that I've just talked about. Incidentally, that's being used on Channel 10 in the morning. They talk about the travel pulse system there and actually show the traffic lanes and that kind of thing. But in any case, the idea here was to go bore down as far as we could in terms of computer aspects to develop a technique that would literally take each individual's data and to say for that individual, this is the configuration that best suits that individual. This requires us, of course, to get some idea of their preferences, not only for the attributes and levels, but their likelihood of choosing a particular system itself, and try to get some information about themselves so that we could not only know what to charge, but how to get at that particular individual, how to target that individual. So the nature of the computer plays a very, very large role because we have, in this case, we could have had, recall the exact sample size, but then on the order of 400 people that were in the study. And to come up now with a model that would take each individual and sort through all the possibilities and tailor-make that one that would be his or her hot button, of course, seems like a very daunting task. But it turns out that there are a variety of heuristics devices, and they fall a little short of complete enumeration, but not far short of that will give you a very, very close estimate of what that person would like without going through literally millions or even billions of possible combinations that could be resulting. And it's these heuristics that are now coming into play and that were used in this case, not only in developing the best single one that I talked about, the best set of clusters, and ending up in this case, I think, with something like 7 or 8 different ones that each would appeal to a specific cluster. But finally, the one-on-one situation of satisfying a given individual. Now, having said all of that, and knowing that it does work, there are two things that I should emphasize. One I've talked about, and that is when we look at the pricing, we have to be able to find that individual to apply this particular kind of technique. And to do that, we have to know something about the individual beyond just their preferences for this highly specific thing. So we have to collect background data, often demographics data and the like, and we use that effectively as a way to get us through that particular hurdle of contacting and being able to reach that individual by developing now a message that would appeal to that individual and his counterparts. The second thing has to do, of course, with the legality of all this and the extent to which you can take, say, any two individuals, one whom you know you would really love it, and actually charge some kind of higher price for that individual. That runs right into Robinson-Patman Act and all kinds of antitrust legislation. So having said all of this about the method and its ability to do this, we have to certainly reconcile and deal with the issue of how appropriate this is and how legal it is, and that we have not addressed, nor are we qualified to address that. It's just saying that the methodology is there if the legal problem is not one of major consideration. And that's pretty much a breakthrough. It's the first application that we've done that we were able to apply that. As many of you know, one of the big areas of interest in marketing, particularly in consumer marketing, is the development of various brand extensions that will enable a given core brand to, let's say, move into other areas of application. Very frequently, a company will start, let's say, with a Sudser, some kind of dishwashing liquid, or a cereal, or whatnot, and then start surrounding that with extensions that carry it far enough away from the mother brand, and yet not too close either to each other, but hopefully closer to other competitive brands. So it's a delicate kind of balance. In one sense, you want to be able to carry over the kind of goodwill associated with the umbrella type brand to another more specific brand of that same company. And yet it has a certain delicacy to it because you don't want, in some sense, to move too far away from it because it might not be all that effective on its own. It might be in some competitive category. So the way these kinds of things get started is again somewhat almost like the Coca-Cola example, in which people are asked to, let's say, look at various brands, let's say all the major competitors in the marketplace, and various extensions of that have their sort of own life, not necessarily connected, if you will, with these mother brands. Of course, that's the whole idea. So individuals would sit down and go through this, and for each of the mother brands, they would indicate from the possible brand extensions which one of those mother brands, let's say, is the one that is most likely to be from or connected with. So you end up getting, again, this sort of table indicating the mother brands and the extensions. Is very similar, as I say, to the Coca-Cola type of thing, but a different structure in the sense of a different application. I suppose if I think about conjoint analysis and what I was doing with it in the early stages, we were viewing it, of course, as a very interesting technique, but most of us, even at that time, didn't realize the importance of it and how much it would be expanded, not only here in the States, but also throughout the world. And it turns out that if we just look at the thousands of applications that are done virtually by almost anyone that has a marketing research shop, and the software that has been developed now to make it almost a crank turner, I never would have visualized that it would have moved that far from the, quote, laboratory to something that's sort of just a well-known, well-used series of techniques. Now, we're still working with improvements, and there are still directions that we want to go in. We want to be able to take, for example, these simulators now that by and large are fairly crude by most standards, make them into optimizers. We want to go so far as to look ahead in competitive connections. If we as a company do one thing and our competitors do another, then what should we do to respond to our competitors' response to us? And we now have a procedure a game theoretic type of procedure that says I should do this kind of thing in response to what competitors do. So we're building on various appendages to the basic set of techniques. But the situation is still that probably 90% of the work that gets done is getting done with these more basic methods that now are pretty much, at least for people at the edge of the field, pretty much passé. I'd like to talk a little bit about the field of market research and perhaps talk about where that field is heading, or at least guesses as to where it's heading. Probably the oldest group of researchers, and I don't mean that necessarily chronologically, but in terms of when the field was developed, we have some, for example, who are very much concerned in our department about strategy and marketing strategy. George Day certainly is a good example, Dave Reebstein and others, that are very much concerned with developing procedures that will help managers. They're working at that very high level as opposed to being sort of, in my own case, being kind of a handmaiden to market researchers who are working basically with marketing research groups. And that's a very important area of marketing, and I'm sure that will continue. Then we have what I would call the marketing research methodologist, which is what I purport to be, where we're concerned with, again, helping the decision makers, but of course at the level of dealing with the public and the measurement of attitudes and preferences and things of that sort, using these kinds of techniques. That's a fairly large segment of our department as well, as just keeping with the department. We also have a fairly large consumer behavior group that don't do, or at least let's put it this way, don't use many of the techniques that we do in the marketing research area, but are very definitely concerned with consumer behavior as a kind of a scientific field of study. What is new that's happening now, and with some controversy, is the development of what one calls the market, the economic modelers as applied to marketing. In fact, we have a couple that are coming in. We have one in already who's extremely talented, and a second one coming in. These folks are interested in the applications of economic modeling to various kinds of scientific questions dealing in marketing. So rather than developing a technique, they may take, let's say, a particular phenomenon that certain salesmen, let's say, are offered more compensation than others, and then try to view that as some kind of a question, a research question, and to try to develop some sort of an economic model that would sort of support the notion that this person should be gaining, let's say, more compensation than some other person, and so on. It doesn't have the kind of immediate wide application, but it involves some very, very strong thinking, and is now developing a kind of a market unto itself. A sub-market of that is what we would call the game theorists. Those in marketing are very much interested in competitive strategy, but from a modeling standpoint. And we have some people in our department that do that as well. But I suspect that the main development that we'll see will be in this economic modeler side. Many of the schools are adding people of that sort. This all raises the question of, will these newer kinds of approaches impact positively or negatively on marketing research methodology or strategic marketing or some of the other groups or subgroups in the department. I take a benign look. I figure that the field is big enough that small groups that have a common interest, as long as they're doing quality work, should be given the opportunity for those kinds of specialists. But not everyone shares that view. You have now people sort of breaking into what they'll call the marketing scientist, as opposed to the marketing methodologist, or sometimes called perhaps better say with the marketing methodologist, but the marketing engineering type of person is also a word or a phrase that's used in that case. And there's been some heated debate as to whether some of the groups in some of these subfields are really aiding, let's say, the decision maker, or they're just viewing the field as a science to say something about. And the methodologist, the marketing engineer, tends to work on applied problems, tends to have focal points in mind in terms of the recipient of those findings. The marketing sciences is interesting in how things work, not necessarily having a short-term payoff or perhaps no practical payout at all, as long as it answers some interesting kind of scientific question as related to marketing, and often using economic kinds of models. I think there's room for all of them. And some of our people are clever enough that they can work and bridge 2 or 3 of these areas. So it's not as though you have to be a dyed-in-the-wool research methodologist or an engineer or an economic modeler or a game theorist, because you can wear several hats. But it does present a few areas from a practical standpoint. Namely, we're teaching material that's very much decision-maker oriented. That's what the Wharton School does. It's a business school. And much of this will be far and away from what they're doing as research. And I think perhaps getting even farther away as these research areas become more and more involved and intriguing. So that's going to have to be sort of dealt with as to whether they can wear several hats. They can teach elementary, easy type material from one standpoint and yet be working in a field that's much more esoteric.